This is a reading of Joseph Marshall's book, The Dance House, the story Oliver's Silver Dollar. Oliver Snowbear came home to the reservation in 1967 after 30 years in the state mental hospital. Those who knew him best will tell you that his insanity was never in question. His sanity. 30 years of his life was spent behind cold brick walls and an 8-foot high fence because of his choice of words. But if Oliver's choice of words is to be called into question, what about the judgment of the person who acted on those words? Oliver's mother and father died in the Spanish influenza epidemic that swept across the reservation in 1919. That year he was 5 and sold heir to 320 acres of prime bottomland. For the next 13 years he lived in 2 households. His mother's first cousin, Effie Grasslodge, took him in until he was 12. But when her husband, who worked for the railroad, was killed in a train accident, Oliver left to ease the burden on Effie's meager means. During the following few years, Oliver attended a Catholic boarding school. Though he was an apt student, his verbal skills in English far surpassed his ability to read and write the language. He struggled with written English whenever he encountered it. After a year at boarding school, Oliver was signed out for the summer by the First Chargers, a large family who couldn't resist adding one more. The summer arrangement turned into a 5-year commitment until Oliver turned 18. The day after his 18th birthday, Oliver succumbed to the wanderlust deep in the blood. The Sicangu Lakota, after all, had been nomadic hunters, and genetic memory could not be erased in 2 generations. He left all but $5 of the $72 he had managed to earn and save in a jar on the first charger's doorstep, along with a note which simply said, Pilamayapalo, or You have made me grateful. For the next 5 years, Oliver wandered over the entire reservation. It was an adventure, to be sure. He was often alone, which was understandable. Not only was he a loner, but his chosen lifestyle separated him from the usual haunts of people. The trading posts, churches, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, issue stations, and the temporary Indian settlements that appeared here and there across the reservation. Though he was 6 feet tall, Oliver was not a big man. There was a friendly glimmer in his brown eyes, and his wide mouth always seemed to be on the verge of a smile. A long, narrow nose gave him an air of dignity, but his coarse, unbound hair hanging below his shoulders made him look a little wild. Years of living outdoors had given him a weathered, leathery appearance, and anyone seeing him for the first time guessed that he was far older than he really was. Oliver cared little for some of the new things that many Lakota people found exciting: a new religion, automobiles, radios, rock candy, the 4th of July, and Christmas. Since he lived life on an elemental level, he was more impressed with the practical things that were part of the white man's culture, such as iron tools, window glass, and field glasses. However, he had no use for clocks, feeling that sunrise, sunset, the sun in the middle of the sky, and night were all indicators of time he would ever need. Calendars were about as useful as clocks, as far as Oliver was concerned. After all, the seasons came and went with obvious changes which didn't need verification from lines, squares, and numbers on a page. Because of his nomadic lifestyle, Oliver reasoned that if he lived like the whites, it would be impossible for him to carry all the things he would need just to get by. Therefore, at any given time, Oliver only carried 2 changes of clothes, 2 bars of soap, food enough for 2 days, a water flask, a good knife, various lengths of rope, and 2 woolen blankets. With these things, he could survive with comfort and still travel fast. Oliver was a hunter and a fisherman. Many a rabbit or squirrel was caught in his snares or fell to a well placed stone from a leather sling. He was especially fond of bullheads and catfish, caught in the shallow waters of the Little and Big White Rivers. More than a few times he pulled 10 to 20-pound catfish from the murky waters of the Missouri. He was a survivor, and though he lost count of the lonely days and nights during his wanderings, rarely was he hungry or at the mercy of the elements. Early lessons drawn from childhood memories served him well, especially memories of watching his father build hunting blinds or cozy brush shelters. Oliver built so many shelters along rivers and creeks, in shadowy draws or at the edges of cottonwood groves, that he used many of them more than once. His favorite shelter stood near the confluence of the Little and Big White Rivers, at the head of a long draw, just below a ridge from a stone's throw away. It looked like nothing more than a pile of dry wood. His favorite shelter stood near, but beneath it was a long, deep, intricately interwoven shelter with a front door, back door, and a smoke hole. Oliver had spent an entire winter there, not seeing another human being from December to March. Years later, those 4 solitary months were to stand him in good stead. One late autumn, Oliver wandered into a small town on the eastern edge of the reservation and walked into a store to buy coffee, failing to comprehend the sign above the door that read, "No Indians allowed." However, 4 white ranch hands made certain Oliver understood the sign. With their coiled ropes, they beat him nearly senseless and then locked him in an ice house. Fortunately for Oliver, the only window in the building was just large enough to squeeze through, which he did. Shortly after nightfall, by the next dawn, he had managed to limp and crawl to a cold creek. After bathing his injuries, he walked upstream, staying in the icy current until sunset, so he wouldn't leave scent for dogs to follow. For the rest of his life, Oliver avoided that small town. He couldn't drink coffee without feeling a twinge of pain somewhere, and religiously stayed away from groups of white men larger than 2. And he never stopped looking for signs that said no Indians allowed. On occasion, Oliver stopped at the first Charger house to visit, never failing to bring food or some kind of, most often 2 or 3 freshly killed rabbits. When he had money, which was not often, he would bring them flour, a slab of bacon, sugar, or coffee beans. On one such visit, Marie First Charger handed Oliver a letter addressed to him from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. To Oliver, the letter was a dark omen, primarily because he knew he wouldn't be able to read it very well, but also because everyone knew nothing good ever came from the BIA agency. It was not until after the evening meal that he retreated to a secluded spot and opened the letter. Though he perused it over and over again, Oliver couldn't quite figure out what the letter said. In frustration, he showed it to Marie First Charger, but her knowledge of English was not much better than Oliver's. In turn, she gave it to her oldest daughter, Fidel, who had graduated from the 8th grade and was able to decipher the letter for Oliver. As it turned out, it contained good news. In one of their rare actions of genuine charity, the Bureau of Indian Affairs had been collecting lease money on Oliver's behalf for several years. The letter informed him that he had $580 in an account to the agency bank. Furthermore, the letter said Oliver had inherited 320 acres of land from his parents and now was of age to take charge of it. Oliver thought about what Fidel First Charger had translated as he rolled a cigarette. By the time he finished smoking it, he had come to a decision. If the letter was telling the truth, his wandering days were over, and he would build himself a house. With the letter in hand, he walked the 27 miles from the first Charger place to the agency, a 2-day walk. In the agency town, a drab settlement with brick and wood frame houses, it took an entire day to figure out where to go with his letter. By the time he found the agency offices in a dimly lit brick building and was finally taken to the realty office, the agency had closed for the day. By noon of the next day, Oliver had signed his name to several documents, none of which he understood. The reality The realty officer had spent most of the morning just verifying Oliver's identity. Then, ironically, in spite of the seemingly complicated officious process, the official had simply ended up taking Oliver's word, although of course he did not let Oliver know that. By nightfall, Oliver was halfway back to the first charger place, camping for the night. He sat staring at the envelope full of money in the orange glow of a campfire. It was all paper money except for one silver dollar, which Oliver liked because it had an eagle stamped on one side. The next day, Marie First Charger told him to put the silver dollar away and keep it as a remembrance of his mother and father. Soon afterward, Oliver went to see a man at a lumber yard in a small town some miles from his land on the river bottom. There he bought a door, materials for roofing, four windows, three saws, two axes, a post hole digger, a draw knife, a hammer, a shovel, a pick, and a wheelbarrow to haul his purchases. He didn't know, of course, that the lumberman had charged him more than twice the value of the goods when he had seen Oliver's cash. Oliver then bought a horse and a length of log chain. Since it was late spring, he planted a garden and then prowled the cottonwood and oak groves along the river for logs. By the advent of summer, the four walls of the 12 by 20-foot structure were ready for a roof, and by late summer, when the vegetable garden was well on its way, Oliver's house was finished. In the meantime, in the town, word had gotten around about Oliver's house. The lumber yard owner had mentioned it to everyone he had come in contact with, raising an eyebrow as he wondered out loud where the young Indian might have gotten his money. No one could recall any robberies or burglaries in the area, and since cash in any amount was hard for anyone to come by in the late 1930s, it was not likely that any individual, white or Indian, would have had large sums of it around for anyone to steal. The lumberyard owner had forgotten, of course, that Oliver had pulled his cash out of an envelope clearly marked with the emblem of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Most people who knew the lumberyard owner were not surprised that he would openly question how Oliver might have gotten his money, although some asked the man why he had taken the money from Oliver if he thought it was ill-gotten booty of some sort. Such question the lumber owner pretended not to hear. One person who was interested in the growing rumors about Oliver Snowbear was Della Wren, a newly hired county social worker who had just moved to the area, being from Maryland. She knew little about the communities in the county and was not at all disposed to learn anything about Indians. Her job was to look out for the less fortunate in the area, which in the 1930s included many whites as well as Indians. But she seemed especially intrigued with the case of Oliver Snowbear. Meanwhile, Oliver was tending to his garden and putting the finishing touches on his house. Anticipating a hard winter along the river bottom, he had piled dry wood, which he would later haul to his place with the horse. Since he had bought a small stove for heating and cooking, he felt confident that the first winter in his new home would be comfortable, particularly since the vegetable garden was doing well and the game was plentiful along the river bottoms. One day he was feeling especially good about things as he sat fashioning a plaque for his silver dollar. The plaque was nothing more than a leftover shake from his roof, in the center of which he carved out a perfect recessed circle into which he fit the silver dollar. Then he hung the plaque next to the window on the west wall just above his small wooden table, so he could glance at it as he looked over the landscape. Every time he gazed at the silver dollar in the middle of the plaque, he wandered through the memories of his mother and father. One gray afternoon, Oliver was pulling weeds in his garden when he saw a car meandering across the prairie. Eventually it crossed a dry creek and wove through the soapweeds, stopping in front of Oliver's house. Oliver was surprised to see a little white woman step from the black car. A strange feeling went through him as she surveyed his place, holding a hand over her forehead to shade her eyes. Like most Indians, Oliver was polite to whites. In fact, he was one of the most courteous young men anywhere. Courtesy was of utmost importance to the Lakota, since to show courtesy was not to offend the dignity of others. Of course, many whites felt that such courtesy extended to them was deferential behavior, an acknowledgment of conquerors, so to speak. As was his manner, Oliver approached the car, nodding politely, assuming that its single passenger was lost. However, the woman, who had been looking at a sheaf of papers in her hand, gave Oliver a cold, measuring stare with her shocking blue eyes. "Oliver Snowbear?" she asked with a hollow nasal whine. Oliver nodded, but he was worried. A stranger, knowing his name, especially a white woman, was not a good sign. He wondered if she worked at the BI agency and had come to tell him that the money had been a mistake. He stopped a few yards from her, head bowed and hands clasped behind his back. "Mr. Snowbear," the woman continued as she boldly sized up the shy young Indian, "I am Della Wren, social worker for Redoubt County. I am here on official business." Oliver understood some of what the woman said. Redoubt County was the northern county on the reservation. That much he knew. Social worker and official business had no meaning for him, but he assumed whatever they were, they must be important to the woman, important enough to bring her out to the back country. Della Wren consulted her sheaf of papers again. "You are an enrolled member of the tribe, Mr. Snowbear." "Si Changu Lakota," replied Oliver hesitantly. "Yes, that will do." Eyes downcast, Oliver waited. "Mr. Snowbear, I need to look at your house." A shiver of dread went through Oliver. It was about the money. Clearing his throat, he stepped hesitantly toward the house, stopped, and motioned for her to follow. A bed, a small bench, a chair, a table, a wood-burning stove, a water bucket, and a washstand with a basin on it were the furnishings inside the small log house. Pegs to hang clothes were near the bed, and shelves for canned food and dishes were behind the stove, on which was a coffee pot. All in all, it was a neat, cozy little house. However, Della Wren was appalled at the dirt floor. Then she immediately noticed the absence of books, a clock, or a calendar. Without waiting for an invitation, she pulled out the chair and seated herself at the table, on which she dropped her pile of papers, as she rummaged in her purse for a pencil. "Sit down, please," she said to Oliver, pointing towards the bench near the table. Meekly, Oliver complied. Glancing around the one-room house, Della Wren scribbled on a tablet. "Mr. Snowbear, how much land do you own?" she demanded. Oliver cleared his throat. Half a section," he replied. 320 acres. That much? My folks," he tried to explain, "their land." "Yes, I thought as much, since you seem far too young to be an Alati." She was referring to one of the consequences of the Dawes Act, or Homestead Act, of 1887, which had allotted land to individual Indians in the West, a process that had been started here by the BIA in the late 1890s and had been finished in 1910. Oliver's father, Seth Snowbear, had been one of the original allottees to acquire 160 acres, as had Mary Yellow Eyes, Seth Snowbear's mother. Oliver's mother had been an only child and the sole heir when her mother had died. Della Wren, who looked a little displeased, then asked, "Do you lease your land?" Oliver nodded. "Old man Gallagher," he said. "Cows." "Yes, you received a back payment, an accumulated sum of $580, did you not?" Oliver thought he knew the gist of her question. The only thing he could think to do was reach in his back pocket and show her the folded envelope, which contained over a third of the cash. He handed the envelope to the woman. Della Wren quickly counted the money. Almost $200, she mumbled to herself as she wrote on her tablet. Mr. Snowbear, this is a lot of money. There must be a safer place to keep it than your back pocket. What if you should lose it somewhere? You would be destitute, I dare say. Oliver nodded politely. Reluctantly, it seemed to Oliver, she handed back the envelope. Oliver inwardly breathed a sigh of relief. She had given back the money. She was a government person. He decided, sent to check on what he had done with the lease money. House, he suddenly volunteered. I put up house. Horse, I buy horse from Sam Nielsen to plow garden, haul wood. He pointed at the small, square cast iron stove. I buy Siegelman's hardware. Della Wren sighed. Yes, you have indeed put your money to proper use, it would seem. She paused as she openly studied his face. Mr. Snowbear, do you have relatives living? Oliver pondered the question. Marie, first charger, he replied. I lived with them some years. Della Wren flipped through the pile of papers, a frown on her pale face. First charger, first charger. She mumbled several times. Are you certain they are related to you, Mr. Snowbear? Oliver nodded. I live with them. Before that, lived with Aunt Effie Grasslodge. Della Wren shuffled her papers again, shaking her head. Well, she decided, I will need to go to the agency to verify that. She began putting her papers back in order when she noticed the plaque on the wall with the silver dollar in it. Without hesitation, she stood and took it down. Is this yours, Mr. Snowbear? Oliver nodded politely. Indeed. Where did you get it? Oliver hesitantly reached out and stood to touch the wooden plaque. I make this, he explained. Cut, carve with knife. The woman touched the silver dollar, rubbing it lightly. What about this? Where did you get this? Oliver pulled out his money envelope once more. Agency man give me. I see. Della Wren replaced the plaque and then pointing directly to the silver dollar, asked, Tell me, Mr. Snow, can you make one like this? Oliver frowned, remembering the few jobs he had had over the years and the money he had managed to earn. He began to nod. Yes, he told the woman, I make. Indeed. Then, to Oliver's relief, Della Wren walked back to her car and drove away. He watched the car grow smaller and smaller as it meandered over the prairie until it was nothing more than a black speck on the horizon. That evening, Marie First Charger and Fidel came for a visit. Having walked nearly 30 miles, they brought dried meat, corn, flour, dishes, and a proposition. Fidel, now 16, was ready for marriage, and Oliver would need help to take care of his place. Fidel was a hard worker, not to mention a beautiful young woman. Since the age of 14, she had a serious interest in Oliver, an interest she had mentioned to her mother a year ago. To prove her worth and her intentions, Fidel cooked an evening meal complete with skillet bread, or sheepherder's bread, as some called it. The dried corn soup was the most delicious Oliver had ever tasted. That evening, Oliver gave his reply, and since the woman he had thought of as mother was now to be his mother-in-law, out of respect he did not look at her as he spoke. You honor me, he said, looking at Fidel. I will try hard to be a good husband and to provide for you. Tears glistened in the girl's eyes as she looked toward her mother, who also surreptitiously wiped at her eyes. I will walk with you through this life, Fidel replied. Soon Fidel and Marie First Charger returned home to make arrangements for the wedding. Days later, Oliver walked to town to purchase new clothes, but he never bought the clothes, and it would be 30 years before he returned home. Indians had been made citizens of the United States in 1924, reportedly as a reward for military service rendered by a few thousand Indians in World War I. The United States Congress enacted the legislation and granted citizenship without even asking Indians if they wanted to be American citizens. Oliver Snowbear neither knew nor cared that he was an American citizen. He had been a free man all his life, surviving on his wits and his skills, owing nothing to any man and servant to none. Understandably, he was confused when men he had never seen in his life surrounded him on the street, showed him a piece of paper which meant nothing to him, and took him away to jail. They had jurisdiction, they had told him, because he was a citizen. They could take him, they said, because he was a danger to society. Though he heard the words tossed at him as he was shoved into a car and driven to an imposing stone building, all he could understand was that his freedom was being taken away from him. After a cold night in a cramped jail cell, Oliver was led into a stark, sparse room and made to stand in front of a man seated behind a large table. Pale and stern, dressed in a dark suit, the man seemed to be more concerned with the pile of papers before him than he was with Oliver. Only once did he glance up after calling out Oliver's name in a deep, gravelly voice. Oliver nodded, relieved that at least someone knew who he was. Then the pale man spoke again, and a woman was ushered into the room. The woman who had come to Oliver's house, asking questions. Della Wren was even less concerned about Oliver than the pale man was, not once glancing in his direction. She immediately found a chair, as she had in Oliver's house, and took a seat. This must be the way of white women, Oliver thought. After a question from the pale man, the woman spoke for a very long time, fidgeting all the while and sitting very straight on the edge of the large wooden chair. The pale man wrote things on a paper as the woman spoke. Neither the man nor the woman gave any sign that Oliver was in the room with them. Oliver was left standing. Although he was stiff from a cold, sleepless night on a hard wooden cot, he waited patiently, holding his hands clasped behind his back. He could understand many of the white words the woman used, but some in between became obstacles, making it impossible to completely understand what the woman was talking about. Words like house, garden, and alone were not a problem, but words like reclusive, incompetent, and simple minded were unknown to him. Oliver realized, however, that these strange activities concerned him directly, since both the pale man and the woman occasionally pointed in his direction. Finally, the pale man gave Oliver a long, thoughtful stare. Oliver's thought he detected. Oliver thought he detected a glimmer of sadness or pity in the man's eyes, but it was gone in a heartbeat. Then the man turned toward a doorway and spoke loudly. Two men with silver badges pinned to their shirts came in and approached Oliver. After another cold night in the tiny jail cell and a dawn meal of porridge, Oliver was escorted to a waiting car. The two men with silver badges drove him away. In the growing light of a cold gray day, Oliver recognized much of the landscape at first, in the eastern part of the reservation where he had walked and camped many times. Then came roads, houses, and fences he didn't recognize, places and things of the white man. After they had crossed over the Missouri River, he saw small towns, machinery, and strange signs along the road. He was in a different land, a place he didn't know. The men with badges were polite, stopping several times to see to his comfort, buy food, and let him stretch his legs. Once they opened the back compartment of the black car, and Oliver caught a glimpse of shackles and chains, having seen such things on a prisoner once. He wondered if they were meant for him, and was grateful the men had not used them. When the sun went down and the land faded into the shadows of a strange half-light, they stopped along a narrow side road. It seemed to Oliver that there had been no evening. That day had evolved into night without a pause. He thought about Marie First Charger, Fidel, and his house, wondering how he would get word to them that something had happened to him. Once he thought about running, knowing he could probably outrun the two men with badges, but he recalled the beating he had taken from the ranch hands with their coiled ropes. These two men had guns, and it was impossible to outrun guns. Besides, he didn't know the land they were in and would get lost. Instead, he put his hopes on the possibility that wherever they were driving him, the men with badges would take him home afterwards. Oliver knew how to be patient and would wait to see how things turned out. Yet there was a loneliness seeping into his mind. a kind of loneliness he had never known. It made him shudder. Even the moon and stars seemed to turn away from him, although he knew they were behind the low clouds. They had driven through a large town with more cars and buildings and streets than Oliver had ever imagined could exist anywhere. North, away from the town, the car turned onto a gravel road. A large sign stood where two high fences came together, announcing State Mental Hospital. Behind the fences were broad, square-shouldered buildings with sharp edges. The car's tires crunched on the gravel, as did Oliver's shoes when they stopped, and he stepped out. His footsteps mingled with those of the men with badges, a hollow echo filling the night. Under a lighted landing, a thick oak door creaked open slowly and clicked shut behind them as the men with badges slowly moved through, holding Oliver by the arms. Oliver shuffled along reluctantly under more harsh lights. A strange, sharp odor he had never smelled assaulted his nose, seeming to ally itself with the stark wooden floors and bare white walls. Another door opened and snapped shut, and Oliver found himself in a small room without windows, where the smell was stronger. There the men with badges left him. Oliver stared at the only object in the room, a long, dark bench with no back or sides. He was tired of sitting, but he sensed he was somehow vulnerable, standing as he was in the middle of the room, not certain if sitting was allowed. He retreated to a wall and cautiously leaned back on its cold surface. Then the door opened. A man carrying a chair entered, followed by a woman in white with a strange small glass object in her hand, an object she held carefully pointed upward. The man put down the chair, sat, and stared at Oliver. After a moment he spoke to the woman, who went back out through the door, opening papers in his hands. The man looked carefully at them, with frequent glances up at Oliver. "Oliver," the man said softly. Oliver nodded tentatively. "Oliver, do you know where you are?" Oliver glanced around at the room. "I'm here. In here," he replied. "Yes, quite. You are in the State Mental Hospital. Have you heard of this place?" Oliver shook his head. "No." "When were you born, Oliver?" With furrowed eyebrows, Oliver considered the question. "In the spring," he replied. "What month is it now?" Oliver looked desperately at the opposite wall. "Who is the President of the United States?" The expression on Oliver's face did not change. The man smiled. He was a young man with a gentle face, a face hovering on pity as he studied Oliver. Uncomfortable with the stranger's scrutiny, Oliver stared at his feet. The door opened and the woman in white entered again, accompanied by a man with bundles in his arms. "Oliver," the young man called out, "follow them." He pointed to the man and the woman. "It's late and they'll take you to your bed." At the end of a long hallway with doors on either side, Oliver was led into a narrow room with four beds, all with gray mattresses rolled atop the springs. The woman unrolled a mattress, and the man quickly covered it with white sheets and bed covers. Then he motioned for Oliver to follow him to the end of the room, where he pointed at the strangest contraption Oliver had ever seen, a large white bowl filled with water standing on the floor next to a second bowl atop four spindly legs. Although Oliver remembered seeing something like it at the Catholic boarding school, he hadn't used it then, but he had a feeling he would have no choice here. White people certainly lived in a strange world. Then the door clicked shut, and Oliver was alone. Darkness permeated the room completely as the bare bulb high overhead blinked out, filling him with a momentary panic. In another moment, a second, much dimmer light came on, filling the room with a strange half-light. Night passed with Oliver curled up on the edge of the bed atop the bed covers. Now and then voices drifted through the walls, and once he heard a scream. Sleep escaped him until a gray light filled a long, narrow window just below the ceiling. He was in a fitful doze when the door opened and the young man who had spoken to him the night before entered with two other men. Day passed with Oliver escorted from one room to another, facing diverse groups of men who regarded him with varying degrees of interest. That night he was taken to a different room, one occupied by five other men, all dressed in the same drab gray clothes that had been issued to Oliver. Again, he didn't sleep that night, only reclining on his bed, listening to snores, coughs, and restless movements. The others he knew could sleep because they had been here for some time. Oliver wondered when he would sleep. The following days blended monotonously into each other. Every morning Oliver trudged between his sleeping room and one filled with dark tables, high-backed wooden chairs, and people dressed in drab gray clothes. The people in gray clothes were difficult to adapt to. They were there in body, but some of them were not there in spirit. Facial expressions ranged from blank stares to confusion to amusement to anguish. To mask his own confusion, Oliver withdrew within himself. One day he was led outside the building into an open space with grass and trees. Though barefoot, he looked for a way to leave, but at every turn there was a high fence, taller than he could reach. Beyond the fence were pastures, corn and wheat, fields, and open country. To the west, far past the horizon, was home, the house, and Fidel. When he wondered, would he ever see home again? A month passed, then two, then three. Autumn came, then winter, and then spring. During summer, Oliver often stood at the fence looking west towards home. On the anniversary of his arrival, Oliver was questioned by three men. "Do you know where you are?" one asked. "Yes," replied Oliver, "I am here." "What year is this, Oliver?" 1938, he told them. He had happened to look at a calendar that very morning, though it had been no less confusing than white men's calendars had always been for him. He could read the year. "When were you born?" "In the spring." "Where were you born?" "Near the big white river," he answered. "Oliver, did you build a house?" He nodded, "Yes." "Did you have help?" "Did someone help you build it?" Oliver shook his head. "I built it." "Before you built your house, Oliver, where did you live?" Oliver shrugged. "Everywhere." "Where is everywhere, Oliver?" He shrugged again and struggled to find words they would understand. "I camp," he told them. "I make sleeping place, branches, leaves. I make fires, hunt, catch fish." "In the winter and summer," he nodded, remembering the snug shelter of driftwood below a high ridge near the confluence of the Little and Big White Rivers. The men exchanged glances, and one cleared his throat as he plucked a large coin from a vest pocket, sliding it across the table towards Oliver. "Oliver," the man said, "what is this?" "Dollar," he replied without hesitation. He had figured out their purpose and the reason they had brought him here. Last spring it was apparent that in the white man's world, a person had to know a lot, and they thought he didn't know enough. That was the reason for all the questions. "Oliver, can you make one of these?" He nodded emphatically. "I make," he replied. The men exchanged glances again and began putting away their papers. The same questions were asked again at other times, but never again by a group of men. For a time Oliver wallowed in confusion and often sat alone in a corner of the large room, full of chairs, tables, and people, wondering how he could learn more so he could leave this place. Try as he might, he could find no answers, so he retreated into the only solace he had, his memories. He wandered again through his travels, and each small adventure became a treasured memory. Each meager meal of fish and chokecherries was a banquet, and each sunrise he had seen brought light to his drab existence. When he thought of these things, he became so immersed in light in them that the present ceased to exist. It was during these times that a man in a suit carefully observed him, though Oliver was unaware of him. Days flowed into one another, seasons came and went, and years passed. One day, Oliver noted that now and then a certain woman would bring newspapers and baskets of fruit to the people in the large room. At first, he took only an apple or a banana. Then one day, he picked up a newspaper and found out that he could still read some of the white man's words. The woman who brought the fruit and newspapers noticed and sat with Oliver. Once she pointed to a word and pronounced it, and Oliver realized that here was the answer. After that, he grabbed every newspaper the woman brought in. After pointing to words he didn't know, she would pronounce them. Soon he looked forward to her visits, and after some weeks began to see the world outside through the words in the newspapers. Oliver kept as many of the papers as he could, those that had held no interest for anyone else. Carefully folding them, he piled them beneath his bed, keeping them neat and dusting them regularly. One day, the woman who brought newspapers came with the terrible news that her husband had been killed at a place called Pearl Harbor. After that, she came only one last time to say goodbye and bring Oliver a book entitled Last of the Mohicans. Only Oliver was sad to see her go. Only Oliver shared her pain. He never saw her again, though some weeks later she wrote him a long letter encouraging him to continue reading. Since no one else ever brought newspapers to the large room or gave Oliver a book to read, he did the only thing he could think of. He read every newspaper over and over again, and read the book several times. One day he asked a new man in a suit for a newspaper and learned about a place called Korea. He saw the year at the top of the newspaper's front page, and counting backwards determined that he had been inside the fence 13 years. The places beyond the fence were changing. Buildings were creeping closer to it. Airplanes frequently flew overhead, and he noticed a different roaring sound that some had. The highway running north and south had been widened, and more cars and trucks traveled it each day. There were also more lights in the distance at night, and the tall poles along the highway were strung with more lines. Inside, the people in gray clothes came and went, although several who had been there when Oliver arrived were still inside. The men in suits and women in white also came and went, with greater frequency than the people in gray. Every year someone sat Oliver at a large table, opened a pile of papers, and asked him questions, and every year he answered them, hoping that what he had learned from his book and newspapers would help him to be able to leave and go home. But each year he was disappointed. Then one of the women in white showed him a new room with nothing but books and magazines, and Oliver began burying himself in them whenever he could. Reading and studying pictures, the world was such a large place, and his life was limited to such a small part of it. He mused. But the books and magazines did what he couldn't do for himself. They took him beyond the fence and the cold brick walls and away from the gray people. One day he sat down and wrote a letter of apology to Fidel First Charger. They took me away to this place because I do not know enough to live in their world. I could not marry you because I am in this place. Life is hard, but you are a good woman. I feel now you have turned into a wife for someone. That is all right. Please forgive me for the trouble I have given you. The woman who was in charge of the room full of books, which he learned was called the library, helped him address and mail the letter. It was the first time he had reached out to the world he had left behind. The world inside the fence, inside the cold bricks, was changing too. Inside, everyone who worked there still was white-skinned, but their clothes had changed. Women were wearing men's trousers, and their hair was shorter. White men's hair was longer, and the men in suits, whom Oliver now knew were called doctors, didn't always wear suits, and some of them were now women. Moving pictures on a wall and inside a small box had been strange and frightful things for Oliver at first, but like books, they had become a link to the world outside. One day, however, like many people in the outside world, he watched in confusion as the President of the United States, a man named John Kennedy, was killed by a man with a rifle. Days later, the television room was filled with people watching as a flag draped coffin was carried behind a prancing black horse. In the hush of the moment, Oliver hardly noticed that someone had put a piece of paper in his hand. After the television was shut off, he looked at the paper, which was a letter from Fidel, first charger, telling about her life since they had been abruptly separated. Father John Steinmark is helping me to write this. There is a lot to tell. My mother died 7 years ago. My younger sisters are all married. I have been living with Ethel to help care for her children. She has not been well. We heard what happened to you. Mom cried for months. There is nothing to forgive. I said I would marry you, so I will wait. Write again. For the first time in 25 years, Oliver wept. He walked outside into the cold November air, for now he had the freedom to walk the grounds, and stood at the west fence looking off toward the horizon, toward home, which until now had existed only in memory. While he wept, his yearning to go home resurged anew. He wrote to Fidel, and in a few weeks her reply came. Her letter was long, filling in details about the intervening years. The house he had built was still there, but falling apart. Old man Gallagher was still alive and leasing Oliver's land through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. After the initial exchange of letters, the information Fidel provided ceased to be important. She became his image of home, and that was all he cared about. Soon their letters flowed steadily back and forth, week after week, month after month, and sadly year after year. Then one day in 1966, home became more than a dream when a young doctor, Dr. Moorhead, arrived to work at the state mental hospital. Whatever the reason, he took special interest in Oliver's situation, visiting with Oliver at every opportunity. One morning, a young Indian man was in Dr. Moorhead's office. As Oliver walked in, a Lakota who spoke Oliver's first language fluently. Oliver, said Dr. Moorhead, this is Richard Last. He's from your reservation and knows some of your relatives. I've asked him to come here to help me to get to the bottom of some things. Is that okay with you? Oliver nodded, sensing a different mood in the room. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he liked what he was feeling. Dr. Moorhead opened a drawer and took out a silver dollar, watching Oliver closely as he put the coin on the desk. I have 2 questions, Oliver, he said. First, about this coin, then about a word. Oliver leaned back, took a deep breath, and waited. Tell me about this coin, Oliver. It's a silver dollar. Why is it important to you? I kept it to remember my mother and father by. I see. Is there anything else about this that you can tell me? Oliver shook his head. No. Do you remember a woman by the name of Mrs. Della Wren? Oliver nodded. Dr. Moorhead, his youthful face intense, consulted a file of papers and then looked up again. Mrs. Wren was a social worker for Redoubt County. She was the person, Oliver, who sent you here 30 years ago. Oliver nodded again. He had figured as much. There was only one thing he didn't know. Why? Dr. Moorhead glanced at Richard Last briefly. Because of this, he touched the silver dollar. Or at least I think so. She asked me once about my silver dollar, the one I kept to remember my mother and father. Yes, I know, I want to ask you the same question. And that's where Mr. Last comes in. The doctor picked up the coin and carefully consulted his notes. Oliver, he said gently, can you make one of these? Yes, Oliver answered. Now, Oliver, tell me in Lakota how to say, I make money. Oliver sighed and thought. It had been such a long time since he had spoken to anyone in Lakota. Ma mazaska wakage, he said. Dr. Moorhead turned to Richard Last. Tell me, Richard, is there another way to say that in Lakota? Yes, there is, the man replied without hesitation. One can also say mazaska wakamana, which means I earn money. The doctor smiled sadly and shook his head. You mean the Lakota words in this instant for make and earn are interchangeable? Yes, Lass replied. Make can mean earn, and earn can mean make. It is possible, then, that someone using the word for make does not mean it literally. That's correct, affirmed the young Indian. So when Oliver answered Mrs. Wren's question 30 years ago, as he just answered mine, he could not have meant that he could craft or produce a silver dollar. No, he meant that he could work to earn one, Richard confirmed. Dr. Moorhead closed the file of papers, stood and walked to Oliver. My friend, he said, in about a week, 10 days at the most, it will be my pleasure to take you home. I hope that someday you will find it in your heart to forgive the world, to forgive us for our arrogance and narrow-mindedness. And by the way, when I tried to locate Mrs. Wren, I learned that she went insane one day and ran screaming down the streets of Cold River without a stitch of clothing on. As a matter of fact, she has been in Ordway 6, 2 buildings over, for the last 10 years. That's the wing where we keep the crazy ones. She was waiting in front of the post office in Cold River, where he had asked her to in his letter. Tears ran down her face as she clasped his hands. He recognized her, but could see that 30 years had taken their toll. But although she was thin, she was not frail, and there was the same sparkle in her eyes that he had seen at the time of their betrothal. I am honored you have joined your path to mine. He said to Fidel in Lakota. There has been no other, she replied. A man emerged from a car nearby and approached, making himself known to Dr. Moorhead and regarding Oliver with great interest. After a moment, the two approached the reunited couple. Oliver, said Dr. Moorhead, this is Dr. Draper from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He and I have been in touch regarding your land. The paunchy man in a rumpled suit extracted an envelope from a leather case and held it out to Oliver. Sir, he said, this is money paid into your account at the Indian Bank at the agency. This is a U.S. government check for the amount of $13,500. It's your lease money paid in by the Gallagher family. I've talked to the banker here, who will be more than happy to open an account for you. Oliver's hand shook as he took the money and turned to thank Dr. Moorhead. Oh, that's not all, the doctor said, taking an envelope from inside coat pocket. This is from the state, the $200 that was confiscated by Mrs. Wren at 20% interest compounded annually. This check amounts to $3,125. It doesn't replace 30 years of lost time, but it can help to make the rest of your life easier. Take care of yourself, my friend. Since it was still early in autumn, Oliver and Fidel repaired their house and moved in. 30 years later than planned, Father John Steinmark married them in July and became their good friend. Now and then, when he preached sermons on faithfulness and patience, he invoked the names of Fidel First Charger Snowbear and Oliver Snowbear as epitomizing those virtues. Fidel and Oliver lived as man and wife for 14 years. Though they couldn't have children, in the spring, summer, and autumn, Oliver hardly set foot in his own house, preferring the sun, wind, and rain on his face. And often in winter he would remain outdoors for a long time as well. One day, her curiosity overflowing, Fidel asked her husband how he felt about the social worker, Mrs. Wren. He answered without hesitation. I pity her, he said. I knew many like her there when I was the people with gray clothes. On a crisp autumn day in 1981, as he sat outside his house waiting for coffee to boil over the fire pit, Oliver Snowbear fell dead. He died happily. Fidel buried him on a rise near their house, remembering what he had said about his selection of a location for the house. From here, I can see who is coming. During the 10 more years Fidel lived, her house was often filled with nieces and nephews, for she was grandmother to their children. But despite the days filled with activity, Every night until she died, before she turned out the light, she would touch the silver dollar in the plaque on the wall near the window. The end.